You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 248 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I'm going to be talking about Syria and kind of setting the battlefield in the Syrian Civil War the best I can. There's a lot of new developments there, but when I started this show and I talked about Syria the first two times, I thought I had a good idea by comparing the situation to the Game of Thrones and kind of explain to people that, hey, look, like, if you're really interested in situations where there's a bunch of armies and interchanging alliances and secret deals, well then, the Syrian Civil War has all that and, it's something real to care about, but, the idea didn't work. But at the same time, I think the comparison, kind of continues to hold up that, the Syrian Civil War is extremely complex. And even though it's been going on for 7 years now and, we're kind of in the post 2015 era of the Syrian Civil War where, Putin has and Russia have come to the aid of the Syrian president Bashar al-Assad, and he is winning the war and will retain control of the Syrian state, at the end of the day. And, there are still some matters left to be decided, but, it's still hard to understand because it's a multiple front war for Assad and really for all warring parties, whether they're worried about attacks from within their coalitions or from outside jihadist groups. Everybody's fighting pretty much a multiple front war. So I'm going to try to break it all down in today's show and make sense of it a little bit for you, especially because, in the coming months, as Assad continues to regain power in Syria, this is something that they're going to be talking about in the mainstream media, and they're probably going to be presenting it the wrong way. And so hopefully this will give you some information so you could tell when people are lying. If you want to share this show, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com or libertarianinstitute.org, and it's there on the homepage. All right, so I'm going to start off by talking about the most recent news, and that is Israeli airstrikes on Syrian targets on September 17th, just 2 days ago. Now, I'm going to say that I'm sure there's still more of this story to come out, and I will, continue to update it as, we get into the further episodes of Foreign Policy Focus and learn more details. But on the night of the 17th, Israel launched a strike on the Syrian coastal cities of Latakia, Latakia, and Tartus, being the home of the very important Russian naval base. And just to go into a little bit of background of that naval base, is the only Russian base on the Mediterranean Sea, and it is extremely important strategically to Russia to maintain this base. And of course, a potential Al-Qaeda ISIS government in Syria, or that potentially leaving the door open for the Americans to come and conquer all of Syria, could have resulted in the Russians losing that naval base. And so, as well as other reasons that Russia wanted to intervene in Syria, one of their key strategic points was maintaining this naval base. Now, there are some reports that France also engaged in this attack along with Israel by firing cruise missiles from one of their frigates out in the Mediterranean Sea. I haven't been able to confirm that. I'm skeptical of that story just because it seems that at least in the past in this war, it's been the United States and Israel kind of at the front of the Western coalition fighting ISIS. And that has at times bled over to attacking Assad. But mostly, the main player as far as the West goes and being hostile towards Assad would be the United States, Israel, and then maybe Turkey. France did go along with a previous U.S. strike on Assad after Assad was alleged to have used chemical weapons, but you don't have that precipitating factor this time of the alleged report of chemical weapons for France to engage in this attack. So it would definitely be a more hostile stance than France has previously took in Syria if they did go along with these strikes. as have previous Israeli airstrikes in Syria. They have engaged the Syrian missile defense and air defense systems. I'm not sure, as far as the tallies go of what actually happened, if the Israeli missiles were shot down or if the air defense systems only engaged the fighter planes and did not attempt to ground any of the missiles that were shot at the Syrian city. It does seem that at least a couple of those missiles hit their targets. It's always kind of hard to tell once the air defense systems are engaged, just because sometimes the air defense systems malfunction or, happen to land in areas held by the same side that uses them. And so it ends up looking like an airstrike hit the city, but really, friendly fire situation. I believe the Syrian government said 2 of their soldiers were killed in the attack. Anyway, one of the results of this attack is that a Russian spy plane was shot down. It is now the narrative that we are getting is that it was the Syrian air defense system that shot down that plane. Now, there's a couple other details to this story. I think that the Syrians are presenting it as that the Israelis' fighter jets were using this Russian plane as cover for their planes, and that's how the mistake happened. Moon of Alabama, who's a pretty strong expert on weapons systems, explained on Twitter that if the Syrian military was using the S-200 missile system provided by Russia, that system targets the largest target in the area, and so presumably the Russian plane would have been larger, and that's maybe the way that this mistake occurred. Or it also could, just been an undertrained Syrian army that mistakenly fired on the Russian plane. There was a lot of hype last night thinking that the Israelis possibly shot this plane down themselves, and it's a great thing that I guess that isn't what happened. Russia, however, is mostly blaming Israel and pointing at Israel as being responsible for this, saying that the Israelis only notified them about 1 minute before this attack occurred. Just like with the United States and Russia, Israel and Russia maintain a deconfliction line for Syria. So the Israelis are going to be bombing in Syria. They call the Russians and they say, hey, we're going to be hitting these targets. It's kind of amazing when you have Russia allied with Assad and Israel being an enemy of Assad, the United States being the enemy of Assad, calling Russia before we bomb the Assad targets and say, hey, we're going to bomb these targets. But that's actually what's been going on throughout this war. And I believe this is one, the important things that kept a mistake, or mistakes from happening, but a mistake from escalating into a larger, issue within this war, that they've maintained these deconfliction lines. But apparently Israel didn't, respond early. And so then maybe, the Russian plane wouldn't have been in the area had they known this attack was going to occur. Or maybe, the Russian plane would have been engaging in certain tactics or, aerial maneuvers to ensure that they couldn't have been incidentally targeted by this missile system that they know their allies have. So it does seem to be that Russia is still pointing the finger at Israel, even though it was a Syrian missile that hit the Russian plane. The United States has responded by calling the attack unfortunate, and Israel, of course, is pointing the finger at Syria. It's hard to say how this is actually going to play into the overall Syrian civil war, if maybe this is enough for Russia and Putin to really stand up and tell Israel that if they attack Syrian positions again, it could result in a Russian response, or Russia isn't going to kind of allow Assad and Syria to take the gloves off and at least dealing with the offensive threat or possibly retaliating against Israel. And so, there's several responses and threats that Russia can make in response here. It does seem that Putin and Netanyahu did speak with each other, and I'm guessing that war is not going to break out between Russia and Israel at this point. But it will be interesting to see how these two countries interact, especially over the Syrian battlefield as, this war continues to drag on. It's also a good reminder that the Israeli position in Syria is just to allow the two sides to bleed forever. The fact is that Assad is going to win this war, and by Israel carrying out strikes against Assad and Assad's allies, it's just dragging this war on longer and longer, and, more people are going to die. Next, I want to move into the battlefield of Idlib, which is in northern Syria. It's generally called Idlib, although I believe the rebels actually hold portions of other provinces, Homs, Hama, Afrin, and Aleppo in that area. And then also connected to this Idlib province and rebel-held area, there is a large area of the northern Aleppo province of Syria, and all this borders Turkey. And I believe this one extends all the way to the Euphrates River. And that is the Euphrates Shield militias that are apparently loyal to Turkey, and there's Turkish troops deployed in this area. And so here on the eastern front of this area is where you actually have the Turkish and U.S. troops driving around and making sure that the U.S. Kurdish allies and the Sunni allies of the Turks don't end up fighting each other or taking shots at each other. So, we really are stuck with this mess right now all along in northern Syria, and it's very hard to understand. Focusing on the Idlib section first, this is the area where the Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra, jihadist factions, I believe, control most of the area. Now, I was just listening to a fantastic interview that I'll link to in the show notes page. It is Joanne Leon of the Around the Empire podcast interviewing Elijah Magnier, who I mistakenly pronounced his name Magnier in the past, discussing what's going on in Idlib. Now, it does seem that while Al-Qaeda and the jihadists control a lot of the actual territory, that where most of the civilians are, including the city of Idlib itself, that's the provincial capital, is controlled by less jihadist, more moderate factions who are looking for a political solution to this conflict rather than a long drawn-out battle with Assad. Now, previous deconfliction deals between, I think the parties here are Iran, Russia, and Turkey, had made agreements that Turkey was to get rid of the jihadist factions within Idlib, and then I guess there would be some kind of political solution eventually worked out here. Now, that deal has expired. However, in staying along with the same spirit, Russia and Turkey, I think, are the main drivers of these talks, are looking to find some solution where Assad doesn't roll the Syrian army through the Idlib province, and they can make all the reconciliation deals that they need with all these rebel groups and then get rid of the jihadist faction. Now, on a past show, I kind of said that it looks like the Idlib offensive is starting by Assad, and they have been carrying out some airstrikes alongside Russia in the Idlib province. These airstrikes, according to Elijah Magnier, were targeting only the jihadist factions and not any other rebel groups, and were happening more or less in agreement or in coordination with Turkey, who, is kind of identifying the jihadist factions and that they cannot get to leave the Idlib province. Elijah said that Turkey has been able to get some of the jihadist factions there to leave. Others are refusing to leave. There's a lot of foreign fighters that are just going to stay and die in that area. These include some people from Central area, I believe Turkmenistan, a primary source, and Uzbekistan, and then Chinese Uyghurs, Chechens from southern Russia, and various other Arab foreign fighters who are, kind of committed to stay and die seeing what they see, fighting the holy war that they believe they're fighting in Syria. And so there seems to be an understanding among Assad, Russia, Iran, and Turkey that at least these people need to die and be killed, and it seems that they're going to use in some part the Syrian military to do this. There was an announcement very recently, and I'm going to link to an article by Move Alabama in the show notes page giving analysis on this, that they've actually halted the offensive in Idlib, and the main reason for this is to give Turkey more time to separate the rebel groups from the jihadists and potentially get the jihadists to leave Syria. It looks like it's going to delay the start of the offensive in Idlib to at least mid-December. One of the most significant parts about this data, of course, is after the U.S. midterm elections. Now, the reason waiting until after the election would be important, of course, is Donald Trump continues to take heat for being too close to Vladimir Putin and too loyal towards dictators. And Bashar al-Assad would be one of them. And so after the election, he may have more political flexibility not to respond, or at least not to overreact to allegations of chemical weapons use by Assad, or the fact that, the Idlib offensive is going to be bloody, and I'm not trying to excuse the actions that Assad is going to undertake, and Russia, some of which are going to probably be unnecessarily terrible, in taking back Idlib, but, at the same time, I don't support the United States getting involved in doing anything militarily to stop it. And, hopefully by waiting till after the election, that could be a political result. One of the details of this agreement that I think are important is that Turkey will be able to deploy additional troops and I believe weapons into the Idlib province. However, they will not be able to provide any air support. And so it does look like Turkey is maybe going to try to carry out some of its own operations against these Al-Qaeda and Al-Nusra groups within the Idlib province. Russia and Turkey, per the agreement, is going to maintain a 15-kilometer buffer zone between the jihadist rebel portions of the Idlib province and then the areas that are held by Assad, very similar to what's going on between the United States and Turkey, where the barriers between the rebels and the Kurds. Now, many commentators are pointing out for Assad that this could be a risky move. This is potentially going to allow, Turkey to move all those Syrian refugees back into the Idlib province. And then, if you do have a political solution, could Erdogan look to break off the Idlib province and make it part of Turkey? Or, could they be a real thorn in the side of an Assad government that has to, care more politically about that, more extreme Islamist Sunni type of constituency that would make up the Idlib province. And so, by not just rolling through with the Syrian army and killing all of these guys, there's going to be a lot more of them around. At the same time, I think it, does kind of show that Assad is looking towards less bloody solutions, even if that is not the most, beneficial way for him. The last thing that I think is important to emphasize is that I do think that Assad is still going to maintain that the Idlib province has to remain a part of Syria and cannot be a part of Turkey. Next, I want to talk about southern Syria. I have mentioned this a little bit recently, but basically you have this, I believe, 55-kilometer, what the United States calls like a buffer zone around a U.S. garrison at Al-Tanaf, which is a border crossing in the southern Syria desert. There are U.S. rebels that operate in that area, and Assad has and Russia have maintained that that area, is Syria and that they are going to take it back. Russia warned twice in early September that they were planning the Syrian government was planning on carrying out offensives close to U.S. troops in that area, and the U.S. responded by carrying out some war games or drills with about 100 Marines and carrying out live fire artillery exercises in the area to tell, kind of Syria and Russia that if they enter into this territory that they would attack them. So it seems like that is going to remain a hot button. At the same time, I don't know how the U.S. could legitimately continue to claim that, they could just arbitrarily state that this 55, kind of half circle of Syria is now protected U.S. territory and no force ever loyal to Assad or Vladimir Putin can enter it. That seems ridiculous to me. And I think eventually, as maybe some of the other battlefields in Syria wrap up, this, will be resolved by Assad encroaching in on the U.S. territory and eventually taking everything, potentially and up to the border crossing actually at Al-Tanaf. Now, there are some other pockets of ISIS within the Syrian desert. I think it's a pretty vast and complicated area, which is part of the reason why the Syrian government hasn't been able to retake all of it yet. And, I guess if you look at the maps, it does seem like that area continues to get smaller and the Syrian army continues to make some small gains. Of course, ISIS mounts attacks out of these areas and kills, either Syrian army personnel or civilians. Now we're going to move all the way east to the Euphrates River. In South Syria, near the Euphrates River Valley, you have the Syria Deir ez-Zor. I think that's on the west side of the river and controlled by the Syrian government. And then a lot of the oil fields and the oil wealth of Syria is actually located on the east side of the Euphrates River. This is held by the U.S.-backed Kurds. and their militia force, the YPG. Now, as I've broken down on several shows in the past, so I'm not going into too much detail, but the complicated thing here for the United States is we're NATO allies with Turkey, but we're allies of convenience with the Syrian Kurds. The Turks consider the Syrian Kurds and their militia, the YPG, to be a terrorist group, and just, the same group by a different name operating in Syria as the group that operates in Turkey, the PKK, which Turkey views as a terrorist insurgency to the Turkish government. So Turkey has long protested the U.S. backing, supporting, arming the Syrian Kurds. Largely, Assad hasn't been in active confrontation with the Syrian Kurds through most of the Syrian Civil War. There's been various skirmishes and fighting between the two groups, particularly in and around Deir ez-Zor, where the United States carried out some airstrikes against, I think, even Russian mercenaries operating in the area. I believe there are still some ISIS holdouts along the Euphrates River Valley in both, North and South Syria. And it does seem like the U.S. would have the potential to take these forces out if they chose to, but they haven't yet. And it does seem that they've been a bigger problem for the Syrian army rather than the YPG in the United States, and that might be part of the reason why. I have seen some recent stories, though, of the YPG stepping up attacks against ISIS. This does come after ISIS has carried out some attacks against YPG positions. That, I think, wraps it up. The situation in southwest Syria has finally, I guess, been resolved the best it's going to be. Obviously, there's still some contention between the Syrian state and the Israeli state over control of the Golan Heights. However, the Syrian government has recaptured Daraa and the surrounding areas from the Islamic State and al-Nusra and associated Syrian rebel groups in that region. And, I guess I just want to wrap up here by saying that the Syrian battlefield, like I've said several times, is very complicated. And, there's shifting alliances, especially within the Syrian rebel groups, that make it very difficult to tell, who is just some Syrian guy who's had enough of Bashar al-Assad and all the terrible things that his state has done over the years and wants to take up arms and free himself and free the Syrians so they could have a better life, and who believes in extremely oppressive Islamic law that grants very few liberties and freedoms to everyone and creates a very hostile situation where there's people running around who are willing to blow themselves up in the name of the jihad and are really problematic and not the kind of people you want in your society. I think one of the most unfortunate parts that you have with the Syrian Civil War is there's just a massive reliance on air power, especially from the Russians and the United States. And, you saw what happened in eastern Ghouta and Aleppo and in Palmyra, where you did have absolutely devastating airstrikes from the Assad and from the Russian government that killed a lot of innocent people. And you also had the United States flatten Kobani and Kobani and Raqqa, the East Syrian city. So, it's not like there's a good side, but, at this point, I think the, important thing is that, look for deals that reduce fighting and, don't believe the propaganda that Assad is just out there to slaughter all of his own people, and that the U.S. needs to do something about it. All right, that's where I'll wrap up the show for today. I did have some other stuff I want to talk about, but I'll get to on Friday's show. Just keep this a whole Syria thing, so that way you can share it with all the people you think want to be updated about Syria. You can do that by going to foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com or going to the Libertarian Institute at libertarianinstitute.org. And my show is there, and my daily news roundup is there on the homepage. If you really like the show and want to support it, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus, Twitter at KYAAALE, and Facebook is Libertarian Union.